I originally had that set up, but things were a little bit too complicated, and this is where I was talking about reducing that complexity in the light setup. But what I mean is that sometimes I'll go in and just duplicate a couple of tube lights like so, and then adjust the color from one side to the next. But in this particular instance, I was happy with just having the two tube lights. They're the same color, and these are just going to create some rim lighting on the back surface and some directional lighting on the front surface. So now I'm going to go in and turn off those specular lights, and I'll show you what it looks like having those two tubular lights set up. They're very close to the surface, so they're going to be creating some nice reflections and some nice blown out highlights. But this is where the main directionality in the scene comes from, and they're extremely important to set up. The reason I've got them set up so tall is because I want to make sure that the reflections are affecting the character from head to toe. And this is where having the power of lighting in CG, you actually have, when you understand how photographers work, you start to really realize the power at your fingertips and how you can do better than what a photographer can do because you can stretch beyond the limits of reality. So there might not even exist a Kino light this long, or if it did exist, it would be extremely expensive. So when you're working with car renders, to take things even further, having HDR Light Studio, when I've had professional photographers sit down in front of me and see what I'm doing in real time in HDR Light Studio, they freak out because they're like, oh my God, like how is it even physically possible that you're seeing this stuff happen? When I've got to sit there and, spend 10 minutes setting up the lights, setting up, and by the time you've done that, like I can already have lit a whole car. Also, you can see I've got a coolish green to blue tint to the light. I always try and stay away from pure white lights when lighting characters or anything for that matter, unless it's something like a product shot where you do need neutral coloring, and the coloring should come from the product's texturing itself. However, because in reality most lights aren't that perfect 5500 Kelvin white, I do like to go more orange or more blue. And seeing as this is a nighttime shot, I've opted to go a little bit more blue. And you can see that color effect coming through the object here. And what it does is by adding that main lighting, it gives things a little bit more realism. But also what it does is that when you do have a more cool blue light source or a more white light source, you get some variation in the coloring of the reflection, which adds to the depth of your reflections overall. So I'll let this finish, and you can see this is where the main beauty from this character's lighting comes from. But we're still missing the HDR Light Studio stuff. So there you go, you can see that these are probably the two most powerful lights in the scene, and when I go to the final rendering, you can see that's where that nice soft directional light comes from. So what I'll do now is after I set up those two main lights, I'm going to enable all the other V-Ray lights in the scene. Everything except the HDR Light Studio pass, because I want to gauge what I need to do in HDR Light Studio to give things that final detailed look. And you can see that even though I've got these two lights set up using V-Ray lights, and the lighting, it does look nice and it does look like I've kind of hand placed it there, you really can't match the power of HDR Light Studio to pinpoint exactly where you want your reflections. And what I mean by that is you can see here that the V-Ray light's reflecting, but it's not exactly picking up on the very far edge. So in HDR Light Studio, what I can do is I can go in and make sure that all the highlights pick up exactly where I want them to. and I don't overdo things and overlight different areas. So I'll enable all of these and re-render, and I'm going to re-render them. This is where I'm going to turn off the override material, and I'll just see how this looks. So I'm also going to turn on distributed rendering. So it'll take a little bit longer at this stage, but I will get a more true idea of how things look before going in and adding those finishing touches in HDR Light Studio. So the render's finished, and to render it at 2000 wide by 2700 pixels high, it took about 40 minutes on my 5 render boxes, which I thought was pretty quick. And the reason why it's rendered that fast is because, like I explained in Lesson 11 Part 2, when you have an object which needs more high frequency detail to be sampled, you can get away with using less material subdivision. So everything in this scene has fairly low subdivisions, like the lighting is fairly low and the GI is also fairly low. You can see the GI doesn't actually play a very large role in this job, but it still does add to the lightness in the metallic areas, so that's why I've kept it in there. But basically, in the sample rate pass, you'll see that it's mostly being handled with anti-aliasing, and the only areas where it's not are the darker areas. So you can see there's a little bit of noise there. But overall, the render does have a fairly realistic quality to it. I'm fairly confident I could retouch this to give it that final little kick of realism. But one thing it is lacking is that it's not really popping off the background. So that's where I need to load in the HDR Light Studio setup, and I'm going to run you through how I set that up. It's going to be a very brief kind of introduction to HDR Light Studio. Remember that in the Mastering Lighting course, it's going to play a very significant role in a few of the lessons. And if you remember me saying earlier how I use a combination of dome lighting from HDRs, scene lights from V-Ray, and HDR Light Studio, some jobs just require a little rejig of that, and you might use HDR Light Studio as the primary lighting source with an HDR being secondary. But also in HDR Light Studio you can actually load HDRs, for example when rendering cars, and then add lights over the top and then bake all of that into one single layer. So the easiest way to get things into HDR Light Studio is to convert your camera to a standard 3ds Max camera. Basically all you do is you select all the geometry. I've just gone File, Export Selected. I've swapped the format to a DAE file, which is an Autodesk Collider file, and I'm just going to bake it out. Leaving everything at default. So once you let that run, and I've already saved off the file, I've loaded up HDR Light Studio here, and when you start up with a default project, you'll notice that there's nothing loaded in the scene. However, there is a live light window that opens up, which will default with a teapot. So in order to load the model, I'll just wait for 3ds Max to export this file, and then I'll just click load here and load it up. So you can see the file's been exported out of Max. So you go into HDR Light Studio, hit load, and then just load that DAE file, and it will automatically bring it up in here. Because this particular model is so high res, it took a couple of minutes to load. But once it is loaded, there's a couple of things I set up while working in HDR Light Studio. You'll notice that there's a background visible here, which is good when you first kind of start the scene because it gives you an overall idea of where everything is. But in the Live Light preview window here, I don't actually want that. So down in the little UI box here, you can see the 3 colored circles. I'm just going to click that and make that black. So now you can see the background's changed, but it's not actually affecting the background in terms of the reflections. So I've set my interface up to work how I usually would on a production job, where I've got the original V-Ray render on the left here, I've got my live light window from HDR Light Studio in the middle, and then I've got the HDR Light Studio interface on the right hand side. The reason I do that is because when I start positioning the lights, I want to have a rough idea of where things were on the original render, so I'm not overlighting certain areas. So at different times you'll see me zoom in and double check that I'm not doubling up the light sources. But inside HDR Light Studio, you've got a couple of different options in terms of how you're constructing your lights and what type of lights you actually want to use. So you can create any type of light inside of HDR Light Studio. You can click where you want the light to be reflected, just like you can in 3ds Max with the Place Highlight tool, except in HDR Light Studio you're seeing a real-time feedback from that, and it's extremely powerful. But I know that I want to enhance the left and right side of the character, and I know I wanted to use kind of contrasting complementary colors, but I wanted to keep things sci-fi at the same time. So the first lights you want to set up are the obvious ones. So you don't want to, one of the hardest things to consider in HDR Light Studio is when you originally get that power at your fingertips, you overdo things. And I did this probably for the first year of my career working with HDR Light Studio. So to get cars looking really nice, it took me a while to figure out that you actually don't need more than a few lights set up. It's just when you set them up correctly, you're going to enhance the look of and feel of the character, rather than just going in and, I can click and just add a light here. I can add another square light here, trying to catch everything on the highlights. In certain situations, less is more. So I've loaded up the HDR Light Studio scene that I used for the front render. And if I turn on the background here and turn the lights on one by one, you can kind of see how I've constructed the lighting piece by piece. So I'm going to go back, and because we're a little bit out of time, I'll show you how the software works and how I've set things up, but I won't have time to go in and manually show you how I got to every single process in this project. It's more to show you what's capable inside HDR Light Studio, and then in the lighting course itself, I'll go in and break down my theory on HDR Light Studio a lot more specifically. So the first thing, obviously, when creating the character is I want to keep the background on, and I want to go in and start with a picture light, which is a really awesome feature in HDR Light Studio. You can see you've got square lights, circular lights, hexagonal lights, and then you've got these picture lights, which are based on HDR textures. So I'm going to start with a softbox, and you can see straight away that HDR Light Studio gives you the ability to not only move things in the viewport and see the real-time feedback, but also to click where you want your highlights to go. So I can stretch the lights, I can make them as big as I want, covering the whole character. I can make them as thin as I want. But for this initial light, I was just trying to get the rim lighting working. So you can see by default the light is a kind of white color. You've got a couple of different options. You can color the light with a solid color all the way through, or you can do what I prefer and use the gradient option. So you can see there's a gradient dialog box that comes up here, and you can tint the inside of the light separate from the outside. So what a real softbox will do is it will have that color gradation through it where the light is brightest to darkest. So I do try and incorporate that whenever I'm lighting things inside of here. It just adds a little bit more realism to things. And you can see if I zoom in the preview down here, you get the fall off happening that you don't have when you use a solid color like this. So you can see the difference there. It's important to narrow down how bright you want the light. Now, I don't want things blowing out so much, I just want that kind of ping to happen on the edges. So from here what I did is I'm just manually moving the light trying to find that ideal positioning for it, where it catches the edge of the character all the way up from the head to toe. So also you've got some navigational tools here inside of HDR Light Studio. I can hold control down and right click, or I can middle mouse and pan. You won't be able to rotate the camera because when you import a DAE camera, it locks it off to prevent you from losing that exact angle that you've got out of max. So I'm just trying to get the rim of the character. Then from there I duplicated this light and changed the color gradation in it to be more of a aqua blue. Once again, making the inside of the light slightly brighter. And then it's just a matter of positioning where this light goes. So I'm just going to move things up to be a little bit higher, increasing the width, and as I do that, you can see I'm hitting that ideal point where if the light's too thin, I don't catch very much light up on the arms here, and we lose that depth that's being created when the light is a bit brighter and wider, sorry. So as I make the light wider, we're starting to pick up some of the edges. Going just a little bit too high. We're picking up highlights on the back of the legs, and we're also getting the inside of the hands here, which is important. So at different points I'll turn off the background just to preview the silhouette. And every so often I'll just kind of let the renderer sample things. You can see how it progressively refines the AA. Just going to zoom out until it's all visible. And I'm trying in my mind to imagine what this light would look like overlaid onto the V-Ray render on the left here. So one thing that I found that was a little bit lacking in the V-Ray render is a couple of smaller hotspot lights that ping off different areas of the character. So when I zoom in here, you can see we're getting very flat results up the top left. And that's one area where I wanted to go in and fix. Also, but we're not really getting strong highlights up in the top right of the neck area. So basically in the collarbone area of the character, there's not much going on. So what I'll do from here is I'll incorporate another picture light. So I'll go in and create another one, except this time instead of using a softbox, I'll actually go in and use one of the halogen lamp textures. And these are a lot brighter. You can see if I drop the intensity down on these, even if I go all the way down to 42 or 28, we're still getting a very bright result. Whereas on the softboxes, as I drop down under 100, we're losing those hot highlights. So the point of these lights is to make them smaller, but to be localized so you're catching specific areas of the mesh itself. So I'm going to zoom into the area where I want to incorporate that light. And I'm just going to shrink the size of the light down. I'm just going to look for some areas where it's catching off some nicer highlights. And this is where I'll turn the background back on just to see what I'm dealing with. So here you can see I'm catching a small rim on the collarbone up here. And if I want, I can add a color, a gradient color to the light, and I'm actually going to make this slightly blue. Okay, another thing I like to do in HDR Light Studio is just sculpt the character's shape with some more soft lighting. So up until now I've only used the picture lights, but another option you've got is to work with some spherical lights like this. And you can see when you originally create that, you've got a preview of the fall off down the bottom left here, and you've got a slider for that. So as I slide that to the right, we're getting a more perfectly white disc light, and then as I go to the left, we're dropping that fall off. And you can see on the character here, if I make this light slightly bigger and drop the intensity, it's got a nice soft feeling to it. But the problem is, by default, the fall off is kind of staying, it's got a cosine fall off. So you've got a couple of different options for the fall off. So you've got flat, linear, cosine, and then you've got custom. So I always like to use a custom gradient with my lights in HDR Light Studio. So you can see what happens is, I'm just going to bring up this dialog box. So if I close that down, I'll just click it again. You've got a couple of different modes here. So I want to load up the Bezier curve, and I'm going to double click inside here, and this gives you the option, just like when we're adjusting our reflection fall off in 3ds Max, we can change the fall off of the lighting itself. So I can add as many points as I like here. Now to simulate more of what a soft light is doing, I always add a second point in and drag that up to the tip here. So in the gradient there is a small hotspot which is going to cause in 3ds Max a sharp shadow when using a light like this. So from here I might sometimes also go in and add a second curve point just to add some refinement to the light. But once I'm happy with how things are falling off, you can see the effect that gives. It's a really nice soft highlight, and it just helps to enhance the shape of the character. So this is where I'll go in and start playing with where I want to add it and how big I want to make this light. Next I'm going to add a gradient color to this light, and I'm going to make it slightly green just to blend in with the green lighting we had in the V-Ray render. You can see as I change that, the color is fitting, so I'm just looking to the left here to try and get a similar tone to the light. So once I'm happy with that, now I need to figure out where I want to actually add the light. So I'm going to look for areas in the V-Ray render where highlights aren't really picking up as much, and I'll use this light to enhance that. So one of the areas where nothing's happening is the shin on the left leg. So I'm going to zoom in on this area, I'm going to look at that, see where I think I might need some light, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and catch some lighting running down the center of the leg to pull the shape off the page a little bit more, off the screen a little bit more. Now because the light source is fairly large, I don't want to, like I've been saying throughout the lesson, overlight certain areas. So I know there's a lot of directionality in the lighting coming from right to left. So I need to make sure that the light is far enough over where I'm not adding too much to the inside shape. So as I pull things over more, you can see I'm still trying to catch just the edge here, and I'll probably zoom in at this point on the legs. I'm just going to make the light a little bit wider Now you can see as I do that, if I go back, we're not getting much shape happening on this corner edge here. But as I make the light a bit wider and a little bit taller, I'm picking up all the main edges running up the leg without brightening the backside too much. On the left leg, or on the left hand side, you can see the highlights picking up quite nicely now. We're getting a small highlight catching on the edges of this thigh pad piece. The same over on the other thigh pad piece, you can see the edge is just catching, but it's not completely blowing out. So you can see when the light's this tall and it's more circular, we're not catching all the highlights up on the ab section. So as I make the light taller, you'll notice that we start to affect everything. I don't want to make it too high though. I do want it fade off kind of around the abdomen area, but I just want to make sure it's tall enough where it is affecting all those different points. So now you can see as I turn it off and on, and zoom in on this area, they're all being, lit up, but just not like overly lit. And what this is going to do is in the V-Ray render, it's going to help with how the shape on the inside section is looking. Okay, so from here, we don't really have anything additional happening on the chest area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this light and then start playing around with maybe getting some more shape up the top, because there's only a couple of highlights, if you see on the left here, on the chest at the moment. But if I go too far to the left, then you can see what happens is the whole opposite side starts being lit up. So you're kind of limited in where you can push the light. I'm going to make this light a little bit smaller. And also you can see what's happening is because the color of the light is the exact same as the one down the bottom here, we're losing the ability to see the difference between the two lights. So I'll go into the gradient color here and shift this over to be a little bit more white. And you can just see V-Rays. It's just a graphics card bug where the V-Ray frame buffer is sitting over the top of all the other windows. And remember, I'm not doing this the exact same way I set up the original Light Studio scene with the lights underneath here. The reason I'm doing that is because each time you go back over and look at how you're lighting something, you get a little bit more clear idea of what's going to look better. So you can see what I'm doing here is on the ab section now. If I let that clear up, we've got the greenish light on the bottom left catching this area, and then I've got the slightly varied color on the top right, and it just produces a nice kind of pulling out of the surface using the contrasting colors there. Also on the chest, I'm getting the highlight spread up a little bit higher. So I'm just playing around with where to put this, getting the refinement. And I'm pretty happy with that. So at this point, there's only one more light I want to add into the scene, and that's up the top here. Even though we've got that shiny spotlight catching the edges, there isn't much rounded shape we're seeing like we're getting off of the lights we've just made. So I'm going to make one more duplication of the light here, and I'm going to pull it into this area, and you can see now that we're getting a little bit more light spread into that upper corner. And for this light, because the original light that was being put in here, this tiny little spotlight, is so bright and small, I'm going to go into the gradient color here and just make this a lot more clear. I'm going to shrink down the size of it. I'm going to turn off the other lights in the scene. So you can see when we have our light on here, now we've got both of them layering up over the top of each other, and it gives you a more candy-like appearance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to align the two lights together so the hotspots match up. You can see when I move things off center a little bit, you've got two little hotspots now. So I want to make sure that they're basically in the same place, like so. Now I can go out and just adjust the width of the light. You see we're catching a small highlight up here, which we don't have in the V-Ray render. So that's going to add some shape to this upper corner bit. So now I'm just going to turn all the lights back on again. And just let this clear up a little bit. And take one more look at it before deciding whether or not it's good enough to bring into 3ds Max. So the last little change I'm going to make, I'm just not happy with how much light is coming off of the green fill light we've put down the bottom here. So I'm going to grab that light and just make it a little bit thinner. I'm going to take the blue light and just increase the intensity of that. And also what I'm going to do is up the top right here, the highlights on the trap area aren't really collecting a strong highlight like I've got up on the upper left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the halogen light we created earlier, and I'm going to duplicate that. Actually, I'm going to duplicate the second one, pull it over to this area, and you can see there's a couple of options in the light, and I've got that incorrectly set up. You can make it additional over the top of the other lights, or you can make it a solid. So always make sure it's set to additive if you've got other lights in the scene. And I'm going to go down to the other one and make that solid as well. So you can see by duplicating that light up, it gives you a small hotspot in the center of a kind of localized area. So when you don't have enough brightness in the reflection, you're not going to bring out the reflections. So I've just added that over the top. Now I've got to go in and adjust the coloring so that it's more pink. And I'm going to make that much whiter in the center. So I can just play with the location of where I want this to go. Let it clear up one more time. I'm going to turn off the background now. And just let this clear up. So I think it looks pretty good. It might not be perfect, and I might need to render it in V-Ray before deciding to make any changes, but basically you get the idea of how the workflow behaves. So from here, you need to spit out this as an HDR, and unless you set it up with the correct settings, it's not going to align in 3ds Max and V-Ray correctly. So the beautiful thing about this program is that because each rendering software changes the orientation of HDRs, but the difference between Maxwell and V-Ray and, like Blender and different types of software will bring in the HDR with a different orientation. When you click render up here, it'll bring up a dialog box, and you've got some options down the bottom here. You've got your preset resolution, and I don't actually need to make this very high res because I'm not trying to catch the details from a full HDR environment. It's only some small point lights. So I can actually go smaller on the size with these type of lights. I don't need to go up to 5000 by 2500. The host, you can just, like I said, you can set all the different software. So I'm going to set it to 3ds Max and V-Ray, and you can see if I swap between them, so if I set it to Maxwell, and I just bring this preview size up a little bit, it changes based on the renderer you're using. So I'm going to set it to V-Ray, 1500 wide, and I'm just going to save this out by hitting render. Sorry, I should say if I bring that up, you can actually change where you want to save the file. So I'm just going to call this finale and render it out. And there we go. I can close HDR Light Studio at this point in time, go back into V-Ray, and this is where I need to set up that last little element of bringing in the HDR over the top of our current Tokyo Big Sight HDR. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up the material editor, and I'm going to drag out the HDR to a free slot. I'm going to set it to composite. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm also going to make this a V-Ray HDRI, and then I'm just going to load up the HDR. So when I bring the HDR in, there's a couple of things to take note of. There's one thing you should take note of. The gamma isn't being baked in inside HDR Light Studio. So where we can see the HDR looking really dark here, when I bring it into V-Ray, you can see it's too bright. So what I need to do is I need to go into the gamma adjustment and set that to 0.45. Now we get the correct gamma being baked in. And because the HDR does have opacity already inside the light, when we save it out, it's not rendering the black as part of the HDR. I technically don't need to do anything other than have these two layers here. But in order to get a little bit more detail from the background showing up, I like to set things to addition, and now you can see it's not cutting out the background details, we're merely adding it over the top. So it's quite important there. You can see the difference between normal, which is going to be causing us a very strong black reflection in those areas, and then additive, which is just going to be adding the light over the top. In terms of the orientation, same as always, I just need to set that to spherical. And because I've saved things out with the correct V-Ray settings in HDR Light Studio, everything should line up now. And when I render this, you will be able to see that additional lighting being dropped over the top of the model. At that point, I can take the final render into Photoshop and quickly run you through the retouching setup I work with. It's important to realize though that because I'm not a retoucher myself, I'm a little bit hesitant to show you how I do things in Photoshop because I work in a very destructive way. if I were to hand this project off to Milton, for example, he'd set it up in a lot more professional manner. It would be a lot less destructive to the image itself, and the quality of the retouching would be better. But I do feel there's a very big gap between the final render and the retouched version that I've shown you guys. So I do want to quickly run you through some of the things I do to the image to get it looking more like that. All there is left to do now is just hit render and see what the results look like. So you can see a problem straight away is that the light I've added in over the top in HDR Light Studio is just a bit too bright. So I'm going to cancel the render and drop the intensity down. So in this top layer, you've got a couple of options. You can either adjust the opacity itself, which is a perfectly viable option, or you can go down and adjust the multiplier. So I'm going to reduce that to 0.4 and re-render. So I can see from the preview here the coloring on the blue and red areas isn't as strong as I'd liked. So I'm going to cancel the render again. Now this is where you can get a little bit creative with how you blend in this top layer. So once this is finished cancelling. Okay, so in the inverse gamma here on the light, I don't have to stick with 0.45. That's just going to give me an identical result to what I'm seeing in the live light preview. But what you also need to realize is that when you're working this way, HDR Light Studio doesn't have Fresnel enabled in the reflections, whereas my materials do. So, and on top of that, this is a perfectly mirror-like surface. So there's no glossiness to it. The appearance of the glossiness comes from the spreading of the light texture itself. So in HDR Light, in V-Ray, we're getting that shader, spreading it out further than what we're seeing here. So we're not getting a true representation. So what I can do is I can go down further on the gamma and just crunch it in. And I'll just do another test render with a gamma of 0.2. Should make things brighter now. I might need to drop the intensity down. But now you can see that color is popping through a lot more brightly. Now also, there's too much red happening on the side of the chest area here. So I'm going to cancel the render. This is where I just make some subtle adjustments like this. I'm going to go back into HDR Light Studio. And I'm just moving that light a bit more to the right. Like so, and I'll hit re-render, overriding the previous one. Now when I come back into 3ds Max, I'm just going to go into the light, make sure I hit reload and re-render. Now there's nowhere near as much red light being cast through. But I've probably lost a little bit too much. So once again, cancel it. I'm going to bring up the preview here. I might make the light just a little bit wider and a little bit taller. And I can re-render once again. Now actually I just realized in this light we've made up here, I'm going to make this a bit bigger too. and I'll render that off. So it's a pretty quick workflow. It doesn't really require too much back and forth in terms of, saving things off. You just hit render, it'll automatically override, and you can just go back straight away and hit render again. Now, in this lesson, I'm showing you the standalone way to use HDR Light Studio, but HDR Light Studio does have plugins available for 3ds Max and V-Ray and Octane, so you can actually see the live preview while you're adjusting the lights directly inside the viewport. I'm going to save that type of workflow for the lighting course, but you get a pretty good idea of how things are working here.